This happened about 6 years ago. I was 11 at the time. It was my first ever overnight stay at a summer camp, and I was pretty excited. This particular camp had a system where it normally functioned as a day camp, but there was one night each week where kids would stay overnight. I was a socially awkward kid, so I had avoided these overnight stays as much as possible, but this one time I decided to be brave, have some fun, and try it myself. Only afterward did I regret it. So, before I explain what happened, I'll briefly give an outline of the camp. It was situated near the shore of an isolated lake, which had very few houses on it. My camping group decided to take advantage of that and agreed to set up a few feet from the shore, in a small clearing located near a narrow path. Much of the shoreline was walled off by low-lying, thorny underbrush, including the area we were in. Flash forward to nighttime. We've set up our tents and sleeping bags, we've eaten our s'mores, and we've set up our sleeping arrangements. I'm in a large tent with 3 other boys, sitting a few feet off from the path that ran through the clearing. We whisper amongst ourselves, talking about the best camp activities, crushes, the nicest counselors, and usual summer camp stuff. We're just about to say our goodnights when we hear the faint hum of a motor coming from the lake. It's unusual for people to be out late at night on a motorboat on a small, isolated lake, but we initially brush it off as being some person fishing. However, the noise grows louder, and I begin to hear what sounds like drunk people laughing loudly. At first, this isn't scary for me. I assume it's just drunk people having some late-night summer fun, and my tent mates agree. We try to ignore it, but we start getting nervous when the laughter and chatter quiet down. I hear the engine shut off, and it sounds like the people are quietly disembarking at the camp's fishing dock, which is a few hundred feet away. For a couple of minutes after, I hear total silence. We're terrified. 2 of my tent mates are completely still while the other is fidgeting and shaking. My gut instincts were right. I start hearing slow, methodical footsteps, creeping slowly along the path. It's clear this intruder is intent on being as quiet as possible, but it's easy to hear when someone's walking in a forest full of sticks, mud, and leaves. I'm listening to their steps as they approach our campsite at a painfully slow pace, when suddenly they stop and grunt. At this point, it's clear that it's a man who should not be here. He was definitely watching us when we set up the campsite. There was no way he could have known where we were without watching us from another part of the lake. The man stands for what feels like an eternity before he begins to move again, but the sounds I hear terrify me. He's moving toward my tent. All my tent mates are laying completely still, mortified but not moving a muscle. He approaches our tent, walking right up to it so that we can see the silhouette of his legs, outlined by the faint moonlight. He stands for another few seconds, then places his finger on the tent. He drags it across the tent, then begins to walk. The man traces the entire perimeter of the tent with one finger. He holds it there for a few seconds after, then grunts again and slowly walks to another tent. My tent mates are terrified, and we're all looking at each other like deer in headlights. We hear him move from tent to tent and walking around each one, with each trace feeling like it took longer than the last. Finally, he walks slowly back to the path, grunts once more, and walks away quickly in the direction he came. A few minutes later, I hear the motor on the boat starting up before hearing its sound fade into the distance. The counselors who slept through the ordeal were convinced that we were faking the incident to prank them. Those of us who reported it to them were ignored, and that is something I hold against that camp to this day. This happened just over 2 years ago, and it has seriously made me rethink camping alone. I was with 2 friends this time, and I worry about what would have happened if I had been by myself. 2 friends and I were on a cross-country trip, and Roswell, New Mexico was one of our stops. We were there for the kitsch, but we were also camping for most of the trip, so we got a site at Bottomless Lake State Park, about 20 minutes outside of the city. We did our thing in town for the day and headed back to our site around sundown. Everything seemed pretty standard at first. There were some neighbors camping down the road and we could hear their music. The Moldy Peaches, a pretty light-hearted soundtrack that didn't set the creepiest of tones. My two friends, who were a couple, read and wrote in their journals by lantern light, and I drank a couple of beers while taking long exposure photographs of our campsite. The music died down, my friends got tired and went to sleep, and after I got the shot I wanted, I did too. I awoke fairly disoriented, somewhere in that state of transition from light to deep sleep. I heard crunching around my tent, not knowing if I was dreaming or not. I just kind of sat up in my tent to figure out if what I was hearing was real or just remnants of sleep. I started to hear it again, and this time it was closer. This sound wasn't just closer, it was directly outside my tent. Understandably, the hair on the back of my neck was poker straight, and I knew something was up. There was a moment when I thought that it could have been a ranger. Who knows, maybe our registration was messed up, or maybe we left the headlights on for the car. I asked, "If someone is out there, can you please make your presence known?" Nothing. "Hello? Please, identify yourself." Nothing again. I sat there, frozen with the most intense sense of fright I've ever felt, and it was dead silent. I calmed myself to lay back down, hoping I'd been imagining it, and closed my eyes. From what I could tell, within the next 5 minutes, the footsteps started moving around my tent. I shot back up and knew someone was out there. At this moment, something so surreal happened that I can't quite adequately express my sense of fright. As I sat there open-mouthed and silent, the end of my tent started to be lifted up by the person outside. I screamed for my friends in their tent, screamed for them to wake up, and that someone was outside. It felt really hectic. My friends were disoriented, I was disoriented, and from then on, I didn't hear or see anything else. My friend was basically yelling at me to stick my head out of my tent and check it out, but I was absolutely terrified that if I did, I'd get my head lopped off or have a gun stuck in my face. I finally worked up the courage and saw nothing. We got out of the tents and into the car, and I told them everything. They seemed concerned, yet skeptical. I was adamant that something had happened. We decided to shine our headlamps from the car in the direction of our tents, which were kind of surrounded by these rocky hills and a dried-up riverbed. As we scanned the rocks with our lights, another light hit the rocks right behind our tents. We decided it would probably be a good idea to leave our stuff and get a motel room, so we headed to Roswell at about midnight. The whole night I felt kind of stupid. I was also really scared. I kept trying to tell myself that I was just dreaming, or that it was a raccoon, or that I'd just seen too many horror movies. We kind of joked about it, watched Cops on the shabby motel TV, and fell asleep. When we went back in the morning, my fears were unfortunately confirmed. We rolled up and nothing seemed to be out of place. Nothing stolen or moved, or so we thought. We started picking up our things and I began to take my tarp off. My friend said out loud, "Well, that is really weird," and signaled me over. The elastic cords that hold the rainfly on his tent were cut. The tent was brand new. I went back over to my tent to see if I had the same, and was immediately drawn to the fresh boot prints that circled my tent, footprints that were on top of mine. That said, we packed up, and we did it fast. We almost didn't even really talk about it. I actually even think that my friend who got his tent cut open is still a bit skeptical. I can't say for certain who this person was, or what they were trying to do, but they certainly succeeded in scaring the living daylights out of me. This happened to me last year on my birthday. I had a few friends over to sleep in my 6-man tent. While I was setting the tent up, my dad came into the garden and told me and my friends to be careful, as he had seen a shady-looking man in a baseball cap slowly walking up and down our street like he was checking out our house. It was about 1 a.m. when my friends and I were sitting on my patio at the table, just talking about random stuff, when I heard rustling in my neighbor's garden. I didn't find this too unusual because it was summer, and I lived in a rural area of the UK where hedgehogs lived nearby. Then I noticed the shape of someone's body emerging from the bush. It was a man in a baseball cap. One of my friends asked what he was doing there, but there was no answer. We asked again, and he chuckled and left through my neighbor's gate. Later on, around 4 a.m., most of my friends were asleep, except for me and my slightly older friend, who was in the same year as me in school. We were whispering to each other, trying not to wake everyone else up. I heard my neighbor's fence rattle, as if someone had hopped over it. A few seconds later, we saw a figure move past the window of the tent. I could barely make it out, but I distinctly remember seeing a hat in the moonlit window. He moved around to the back of the tent, so I decided to wake everyone up and run back inside my house and into the living room. A good half hour passed when I heard police sirens outside. This wasn't possible, as my mom was asleep and my dad worked nights. I looked outside to see 3 police officers in my garden where the tents were, and my neighbor talking to another officer. After a few minutes of watching through my back door window, the police walked out of my garden with a man in his early 40s in handcuffs. I saw my neighbor, and he gestured for me to come outside. My friends followed behind, and we spoke to him. Note that my neighbor is in his late 80s and lives alone. He said that he was getting a glass of water from his kitchen when he saw his security light turn on in his garden. He quickly glanced over and saw a man hop over his fence and into my garden. He then called the police, who said they would come over. After telling me this, a police officer walked over and informed me that the man they arrested was a burglar who had broken into multiple houses in the local area. What he said next still makes me shiver. They said they found him crouched down in the corner of the tent with a large knife. He then advised me and my friends to get our stuff and sleep in the living room. By this time, my mom had been woken up by all the commotion, and she had been given the same information. She called my dad and told him what happened. I don't think I will ever sleep in a tent again.